Time now to move on to our next speaker, and I'm delighted to introduce you to Oliver Lord. Now, Oliver Lord is Head of Policy and Campaigns at the Global Clean Air Environmental Defence Group Europe. It's a long title, Oliver. I hope I got it right for you this morning, but tell us a bit about the work that you're doing there.
Thanks, Rachel. Yes, I'm from Environmental Defence Fund Europe. We're part of a global NGO, and I'm part of our Global Clean Air Initiative. We're putting demonstration projects across the world in California, China, India, and here in the UK. And we're working hard to make that invisible visible, which is exactly what Francis was saying needs to happen. And in the US as well, especially working on the electrification of medium and heavy duty vehicles, which of course is very linked to the freight sector. So next slide, please. So Francis was talking about helping people to understand and be more aware of the impact of air pollution. And actually around the world, 1 billion people lack the information about the air they breathe, and we're determined to try and put that right. So we're a big supporter of the OpenAQ project, which I've put a thumbnail of the launch of their new report. And this is a platform that we've been contributing to with a project we did in London called Breathe London, which doubled the amount of air quality monitors using smaller, lower cost sensors so that we could calibrate the technology and then start to spread that more globally into areas where people don't have access to this information. And as the UN Secretary General said, when urban communities are engaged in policy and decision making and empowered with financial resources, the results are more inclusive and durable. And that's exactly what air quality monitoring is about. And it's about finding air pollution hotspots in cities so that we can take action quickly. We can measure how well interventions are working. And we really know, we've learned from, for example, the history of diesel that and combined heat and power technology in buildings, that we need to learn the lessons of policies that have been brought in, because sometimes they don't quite match where we want to be headed. And of course, raising public awareness as well, because we know that if we're in London, where we're doing a lot of our work at the minute, it really affects people's decisions in their day-to-day lives, and especially parents and those cycling around the city. Next slide, please. But we learn from this data that the burden of air pollution is not equal. This is some new analysis we've been doing that should be out later this week. We found, so I'm going to talk a little bit about NOx emissions today as well, which is related to nitrogen dioxide, a harmful gas in the atmosphere that is also invisible. And the UK has been breaching legal limits for the past 10 years and continues to do so, especially in London. It's a diesel issue predominantly. And when we look at the levels of this pollutant at primary schools with pupils from the most deprived areas, so the pupils that are attending from the most deprived areas, we're seeing a 27% higher level of this pollutant than those in the least deprived. And the same applies to pupils that come from Black, Asian, minority ethnic background as well. So we also need to be tackling these health inequities in society with this data. And, quite frankly, we need stronger representation and voices from these communities. And sadly, today's panel is an example of that, but we need to do more. Next slide, please. So using this data, we can also start to understand what the causes of the pollution are. And when we look at emissions inventories put out by London, diesel vans, for example, can make up to 25% of the road transport NOx emissions. And you can start to make out the road network there. And even the latest diesel technology in cars, for example, they regenerate. So their diesel particulate filters, thinking about the PM 2.5s that Francis was talking about, at times they'll emit 1,000 more than they're allowed to because of the way that filter technology has to regenerate and actually splurge it out into the city. Next slide, please. So you link that uptake of diesel technology, and then you link it with the growth in van traffic and delivery traffic as well. And the McKinsey model for the World Economic Forum has shown that delivery vehicles in the 100 largest cities will rise by 36%. And you can see that we're seeing an exponential growth in van traffic as well. So it's a bit of a double whammy coming our way. Next slide, please. So when you link that together, you have to start to think about what action and policies we need. So especially for nitrogen dioxide, we need to see diesel-free cities. And that's exactly where clean air zone policies really will have an impact. And we have to work with those, because it's the only credible way to be meeting the legal limits in our cities, having less polluting vehicles. We also need to see much more incentives for electric vehicles and support. So it's great to see the fleet that DPD have been introducing, and especially in London, more priority for these vehicles in cities, perhaps nighttime access for couriers because they're much quieter as well, and noise pollution is also a big issue. But this is part of a global movement. So I've put a thumbnail there of C40 Cities Green and Healthy Streets Declaration. Major cities around the world will be introducing zero emission zones soon. And that means full zero emission vehicles, not just plug-in hybrids, which often have quite weak electric motors. Next slide, please. So we go with cleaner vehicles, but we also need fewer vehicles. And this is also related very strongly to the PM2.5 issue, because when we look at, for example, the concentrations of PM2.5s by primary schools, you can see a huge wave coming from the tire and brake wear of vehicles. So thinking about the government's commitment to promote cycling for the carriage of freight in their new vision, and also the DPD approach to switching to more cycling freight as well, is really going to be essential to bringing down those levels of PM 2.5, tackling the local sources, of course, because there's other sources coming into the city. Next slide, please. So when you kind of put that together, I'm starting to sort of throw a vision to you that actually we really need to rethink how the roads are working in our cities to tackle this pollution problem. And in the middle of the busiest roads that you can see in London, on the left are the levels of PM 2.5, on the right is the noise pollution this city faces. You can really make out that road network. So if we can bring those policies together and help to transform the roads where a lot of people live, then we're going to make it better for everyone. So if you had £27 billion to spend on building new roads in the UK, perhaps you would actually want to spend it, next slide please, on unbuilding some of the roads that are actually causing the biggest damage to health in the UK. And here's a couple of examples from Spain that, to get our juices flowing. So I'll finish with this last slide, which is just some more reading for you, which is around a blueprint that we put out on air quality monitoring, and then also a recent bit of research that we've done into looking how couriers and drivers that own their own vehicles can come together to purchase vehicles and actually make it more affordable for them. Thanks very much.
Oliver, thank you so much. And it's always shocking, isn't it, to hear how regularly governments, including our own, breach legal air pollution limits as well. Again, loads of questions coming in here. Let me start off with a sort of very simple one. In your experience, what do you consider to be an essential component of successful clean air policy?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose for me, it's about putting in timescales into that policy. So, for example, when I used to work with the Mayor of London, and we developed the ultra low emission zone, and we worked with industry to give a suitable timescale so that they can move with the grain. So I think the introduction of clean air zones, for example, setting that policy and saying in a few years' time things are going to change, then I think you can really bring the business with you rather than going against it.
Sasha has asked this question: should there be policies in place to make people more aware about the air they breathe, for example, when they're buying a house, where they work, where they go to school and so on? And how would you suggest that this is best communicated? Are we going to see that increasingly being used, do you think?
I think that's really important, especially for at-risk groups. So thinking about the parents and school children. In London, there's actually an alert system, and that's something that sadly the UK lacks. Really, it's all down to a small Twitter feed from DEFRA. So I think that a lot more could be done about that. And like we were talking about, you know, if you give people more information, the more they're going to act. And as we know, I've got a psychology background. It's when people actually change significant moments in life. So moving house is a really good one. If you can give people, empower people the information to understand the pollution levels at certain times of day, but also the choices they have to move around when they move into that new neighborhood. There's a local bike route, there's a car sharing scheme nearby, and that's when people will change their habits.
But interestingly, you also rightly highlight the health inequities that we're facing at the moment, which again have been really highlighted by COVID. And you could start paying a premium, couldn't you, for better air quality, and that doesn't solve the problem.
Not at all, no.
And just finally, one here before we move on: does air pollution affect mental health? Over the last 10 years, we've seen a jump in mental health and pollution. Are the two linked? What do we know about that?
Well, it's incredible, like the health research coming out with the links with air pollution. There was a recent research into the impact on dementia, which is really sad. And we saw the research coming out from British Lung Foundation showing how many care homes across the UK are cited in areas that breach World Health Organization. But you link, as I was saying, you link like getting cleaner electric vehicles and getting out of diesel with quieter vehicles as well. And you can see the crossover there with noise pollution, which is often not talked about enough. And I think the two come together to make a stressful environment for people and affect their mental health.